How should Christians persuade others to their point of view? Are there some better or worse or more faithful or less faithful ways to do that? What is the role of apologetics and repentance and the Bible in evangelism? And what are the roles of men like J.R.R. Tolkien and Cornelius Van Til, whoever that is, in defending the Christian faith? We'll talk about all of that and much, much more on this episode of Theology on Air. I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm pastor at First Lutheran. You are listening to Theology on Air, which is an outgrowth of Theology by the Pint, which is a monthly ministry here in Houston, where about every month we get together around craft beer and talk about interesting things, philosophy, theology, ethics, apologetics,
culture wars
as well. Culture wars.
Spicy things.
Yes, and so this is kind of a debate, you might say, on apologetic methodology, what's sort of the best way to defend the Christian faith. We'll define all of our terms, but first, let's go around the room and defend our... By the way, this is audio only. My new Apple computer totally bugged out. It does not like the broadcast software, so... We had a big fight about it, and it won. And
we could just describe what everyone's doing. Like Austin's making a weird face, and it'd be fun.
Yes. Well, that's kind of a thing.
Evan
Kamala
sits
Harris
at his ease to the left of the room in a blue
like when
sweater.
you accidentally hit the English audio subtitle thing, and they're like,
Absolutely.
"Man in blue sweater looks contemplative." Anyway.
Well, speaking of, to my left, is Jonathan Brack.
Who are you?
I am an administrator at Westminster Theological Seminary. I'm the senior director of communications there. And I also happen to live in Houston. So this is my first time on the podcast and meeting all of you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You have to come back.
Yep, we'll get you back soon.
Well, we'll see how it goes, but probably we'll have you back.
Yeah.
So.
He has a nice soothing voice, though, but don't talk for too long because that soothing voice could lull people. We need them sharp and ready.
It's gotta be spicy.
And you're going to be defending the presuppositionalist.
As best I can. I'm
Yeah.
not an academic. I don't call myself one. I'm an administrator at Root, but I know enough about Van Til to be slightly dangerous.
Okay, already people are like, who the heck is this Van Til guy? We'll get there. I'm Sarah Stone. I'm the executive director for Theology by the Pint, and I'm just here to make sure this stays interesting and doesn't get too nerdy. Who are you?
I'm the person that thinks nerdy things are interesting, I guess.
Sometimes I do too.
My name is Austin M. Freeman, and I am the chair of apologetics and assistant professor of theology at Houston Christian University. And we have the best program in imaginative and cultural apologetics in the country. So we offer degrees for undergrads and master students in apologetics. If this floats your boat, then I would urge you to come check us out at Apologetics Day on March 22nd at C3 Church here in Houston.
Now you have to air this before then.
Yeah, yeah, I guess so.
When?
Or go back and get the recording from...
Yeah, we'll get there.
March 22nd. But yeah, this is something that Evan and I and Sarah have skirted around for a long time, and we said, let's just do a whole episode on this. And as a academic apologist, I am all the way on board.
Cool.
Well, it comes up because in my tagline, so to speak, for White Pill Radio, which our podcast audience will know that's our happy fun podcast every other week, looking at Christian worldview, and I say we're post-apologetic, and I sort of... Anyway, I'm not going into a whole explanation of why I do that, but the summary is that I think we're living in such irrational times that I'm sort of beyond rational apologetics. Like, if you only knew all the evidences for the resurrection, you would really change your mind. As if the hardened unbelievers out there going, please, someone just make a convincing argument to me, and I'll change.
That's all I need. Yeah.
So to summarize kind of how I got into all this, I mean, I think Cornelius Van Til, to lay my cards on the table, was prescient, basically a prophet of the mid-20th century, who I think saw way in advance the worldview clashes that were coming at a time when the world he lived in was mostly Christian, and I think he understood the hostility that was to come toward the Christian worldview, and I think he understood that the classical apologetic methodology was not wrong, but sort of insufficient to the day. And so so for the sake of the listener, they're developed sort of multiple schools of thought of apologetics or defending the Christian faith. And so the Cornelius Van Til school is the presuppositional, broadly speaking, school. And within that school, there are different camps.
Sure.
David Clark, is that his name?
Gordon
Clark, so he has a point of view and he's different from Van Til in some ways. And then you have evidential or classical apologetics, like R.C. Sproul. By the way, Van Til is a Reformed Calvinist Presbyterian. That almost exclusively presuppositionalism is in that world. In the world.
One of the first professors of theology at Westminster Seminary when it spun off. Yeah,
thank you. And he was a philosopher, so some of his stuff is way over my head for sure. But so someone like R.C. Sproul is also Presbyterian, a Calvinist, Reformed, but he is not a Van Tilian presuppositionalist. He's in the classical camp. Then those in the, I would argue, the more Wesleyan, Arminian camp tend to be on the evidential side. And I think there are reasons for that. But, so like the William Lane Craigs or the Frank Turek's of our day or whatever, they are, there's all these books about the cosmological arguments and, so the creative apologetics or
imaginative
apologetics. Thank you. That's I don't know how new that is, but it seems like a new kind of wrinkle to
or at least
the
a new word for something.
Yes. So again, this is a good point, Sarah. The concept has been around for a lot longer than the name has. But the way that I pitch it really is when we look at the passage in Samuel when the prophet Nathan comes to David after David has committed adultery with Bathsheba and sent her husband away to be murdered. Nathan comes to David and he says, look, there was a poor man who had a lamb, and he loved this lamb, and it ate the bread from his table, and he slept with it at night, and his kids played with it. And his rich neighbor, who had plenty of lambs, had a person come to eat dinner with him, and he didn't want to kill any of his lambs, so he took the poor man's lamb, and he killed it, and he served it to his guest. What should be done to this man? And David says, well, this man is surely worthy of death. Like he should repay the lamb that he has taken because he had no right to do that. And Nathan says, "You are that man. You are the man."
VeggieTales version.
Yeah. And David has this dawning realization, and he says, "Wow, he's right." So what happens? Nathan could have come to David and said, "You need to repent of your sin. You committed adultery. You stole another man's wife." David is a king. David doesn't want to hear that. None of us want to be accused of sin, right? We're defensive, and unless the Holy Spirit has already been working in us, we're going to put our walls up really quickly. So what Nathan does is he doesn't even use a strict metaphor. He doesn't say, "Hey, David, it's as if you were a rich man that stole a poor man's lamb." He puts in all of these details about how the lamb sleeps with him and what they're feeding him. He gives all this story that allows David to inhabit the landscape of this poor shepherd, and that's what makes David realize what he needs to change. So through the faculty of imagination, you are paving the way for exactly what Evan is talking about, people to want Christianity to be true, and only then will they listen or care when you say, "Wow, I wish that a world like this existed." You say, "Well, let me show you how logically, philosophically, and theologically it does."
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
Is that a good summary of your position? Because that was the first thing I wanted to do, is just lay those out.
Yeah, so that's what we do at HCU. We're the best in the world at what we do, to quote Wolverine. We specifically have a strong offering in the Inklings, and so that's why we mentioned J.R.R. Tolkien. That's kind of my specialization. Is Middle Earth seems to be a very good avenue for introducing people to Christian metaphysics. Strangely enough,
the Inklings are
J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and other people who existed in 20th century Oxford and were both academics and imaginative fiction writers.
I was just going to say, for those listening, if you're not in this world, the sort of camp that Austin's going to be kind of representing also is people. We've had a lot of these people on our show. So people like J. Warner Wallace, Gary Habermas, Greg Kuchel. I mean, just anyone that says, here's a cool way to understand evidence for why Christianity is true. So you mentioned, Evan, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, any of these arguments that say like, hey, if this is true and you'll go down this road with me, then as you can see, it's like if A and B are true, then C has to be true. And C is that, God is real and Jesus is God and you need him to be saved. So that's kind of the classical / evidential /
So
imaginative.
there is a subtle difference between classicalism and evidentialism,
Okay.
but it really only has to do with the order in which you take things. So the classical method is you begin with the arguments for the existence of God. You establish that God.
Yeah.
So you establish that God exists, and then you establish that God raised Jesus from the dead.
Right.
If you can establish that God raised Jesus from the dead, well, that validates the message of Jesus, which then gets you the authority of Scripture, the role of Israel in the Old Testament, the hypostatic union, the Trinity.
the hypostatic union?
The two natures of Christ, human and divine. Yeah. So if you can authorize Jesus' message and teachings and his commissioning of the apostles to carry on those teachings, then you get the rest of Christianity.
Yeah.
So it goes God, resurrection, theology.
And we kind of see that just in when you talk to a lot of people, especially people that aren't in the Bible Belt in America. There's kind of, Romans 1 talks about this idea that you look around and there's just a sense that someone's in charge of all of this. So that gets you to theism, right? That there's something that we would call God that's in charge of everything. And then you move from there. Okay, so that's that camp. And then there's this camp that Evan and Jonathan inhabit, which is not antithetical to that, but it has a kind of different approach. So
Van
maybe
Til
this
was
is
antithetical to it, but I'll let y'all defend your own position.
Well, let's not get into fighting
I
yet.
think the issue is that he's antithetical at particular points of principium. And so
We're going to need to know what that word is.
your principles, your starting points.
Oh, okay.
And so he would say, he actually says, Van Til says, use all the classical arguments for the existence of God with unique probative force.
Unique probative force.
Yeah, so
okay.
use them with their inherent probative force. In other words, use them liberally. However, when you use them, don't pretend that you have some sort of shared dictionary of what evidence and proof means.
Okay.
So what he was basically saying is use those things as they are defined by the ontological God of Scripture, not as they are defined by John Locke or Hegel or Descartes or Aristotle. So not as those things are defined or picked up in human tradition, as if there's some sort of shared definition of what counts as proof, what counts as logic, what counts as evidence. Instead, understand that all those things like proof, evidence, yes, those are true. And people usually infer them as true, but they're only true because God has actually allowed them and has made them true. And so that is basically what Van Til's issue is with, in fact, the first course he taught at Westminster was called The Use of Evidences. And so he came to Westminster Theological Seminary, started teaching apologetics, and all he was trying to do was to say, look, when we talk about the doctrine of Christ, where does our doctrine of Christ come from? It comes from the Scriptures. When we talk about the doctrine of God, where does our doctrine of God come from? It comes from the Scriptures. When we talk about doctrine of salvation, where does our doctrine of salvation come from?
Scriptures.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when you get into apologetics, where does our apologetic method come from? And Van Til would argue, well, God actually has commanded us to do apologetics in 1 Peter. Mm-hmm. And so the Lord has given us the method in his scriptures by which we must defend the faith. And so what does it look like? It looks like exactly what you see in Romans 1, Acts 17, Colossians 2, where there is, yes, as you were saying, all men do know God. Calvin calls it the sensus divinitatis. However, all men know God, and they also suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So you have to reckon your apologetics with that truth and seek to demonstrate carefully with gentleness and reverence that reality. So you can use a cosmological argument, an ontological argument, a teleological argument. Those are all helpful. However, what's back of that is the ontological trinity that gives anything, those arguments, any force whatsoever. So if you have a different worldview or a different definition of how causality works, what is matter, what is metaphysics, what is epistemology, those are actually futile in and of themselves. And so that's what Van Til is trying to bring to bear to apologetics.
So the word presuppositional comes about because he would argue that God must be presupposed. So like in the classical school, it's like first God, then Jesus, then whatever. But like the first God is like an awfully big step, I think,
From nothing to God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the whole kind of shooting match. And I would even say that, like, if you read like Van Til, he is talking about addressing belief in God to unbelievers. So, you know, within the supernatural world, even if someone doesn't believe, isn't a Christian, but they believe that God exists, like a Tim Pool, for example. Okay, or just I'm thinking of kind of a public person who's like, well, I'm not a Christian, but I believe
Jordan
God
Peterson.
exists. Yeah,
Joe Rogan
yeah, someone kind of beyond.
Does he
that
believe in God
threshold,
now?
believes in the something.
Okay.
some kind of evidential conversation may make more sense, but like. When we talk about like presuppositionalism, like we're talking about unbeliever, like a kind of a rank atheist. That's my understanding of it anyway. But let me try to keep setting some groundwork though.
Sure.
Well, hold on.
Yeah.
You said we're talking about an unbeliever, someone who doesn't believe that God exists. But you've now departed from what Scripture tells us, which is that there is no such person.
Right. I mean, superficially, who says?
Or they claim.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a fair point because Romans 1 would argue that all know that God exists, but suppress the truth in unrighteousness.
So suppressing is different than not believing. So and the strategy.
Well, it's how we see it.
Yeah, the strategy of getting somebody to believe a truth is different than getting somebody to admit a truth.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a schizophrenia, as Bonson would call it, which is in Romans 1, you have both Paul saying, all men know God, and then later on in that very passage, I think it's verse 31, yet they do not see fit to epignosis, give account, give knowledge to.
Recognize.
And so you have that dualism that's happening, that schizophrenia, that is, they know God, but yet they suppress him, and they do not know him at the same time. And people are like, well, Van Til, which is it? Do they know or do they not know?
You're like,
and it's
yes.
like, well, which is it? Is it Romans 1 or is it 1 Corinthians 2? They know God, or the natural man cannot know God. Which one is it? It's like, well, Paul says both of these things. And so it's pretty simplistic to say, well, Van Til kind of disagrees with himself because he's getting his methodology, I think, at the end of the day from Paul.
Yeah.
So do you think that Paul is using the words in the same sense, in saying two different things, like it's both A and not A? Or do you think he means a different thing when he's talking in 1 Corinthians than when he's talking in Romans?
I think he means in Romans 1, the sensus divinitatis that holds. I don't believe what Thomas says, which is Thomas thinks it's the natural light, and that it's just a few Greeks that understand this, Greek philosophers that he says in his Romans commentary. I think that Calvin is right that he means all men know God. In 1 Corinthians 2, I think he's talking about the supernatural, which is that no man can come to an eschatological saving knowledge of God, and therefore they can't come to a true understanding of who he is. And so I think he uses both of those in that way between Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 2. Still to this day, I've yet to read anybody give a response to Richard Gaffin's article, which was in Revelation and Reason, and it's on epistemological reflections on 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, and where he talks about the eschatological divide of knowledge between the unbeliever and the believer, and that it's unable to be, that man cannot cross the eschatological divide between unbelief and belief, is what Gaffin's point is. But there, Paul makes this particular point where the spiritual person judges all things. And we take that and we're like, well, does that mean that I can just carte blanche say whatever I want to as a spiritual person? And no, what Gaffin shows exegetically is that what Paul's thrust of that verse is that there's not anything greater to which the Christian can appeal to than the Spirit of God illumined in his heart, and that by that he makes all of his judgments of the world. And so it is the precondition for intelligibility, to put it a different way. And so I still have yet to see anybody respond to Dr. Gaffin's piece on 1 Corinthians 2.
I've never even heard of it.
That's probably why we haven't responded. But now the responses will flow.
It seems to me like the presuppositional position is in the Reformed world because of the Reformed theology's understanding of man.
Say a little bit about that.
Well, man is dead in trespasses and sins. And so man is unable, even though he does have a knowledge of God, being made in God's image, and that can be appealed to in the apologetic methodology, or in simply shaming somebody for wrong behavior, for example. You can appeal to the image of God. You can appeal to their knowledge of God. So it is true that all men do know that God exists. But before regeneration, I would argue, like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12, no one can confess Christ as Lord apart from the Holy Spirit. So I'd argue
Or in Ephesians, they're dead. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a pretty negative view. Whereas the more Wesleyan Arminian school
Or Catholic.
school is that,
Orthodox.
well, yeah, we're in bad shape, but I mean, we're not dead, or like, there's still, it's like the Terminator, like I've got reserve battery I can click on like just when you think I'm dead.
Well, the
Hey guys, Sarah Stone here. Sorry to interrupt what I'm sure is a riveting podcast episode, but Theology by the Pint needs your help to continue providing these podcasts, offering our in-person events, and growing so we can bring thoughtful conversation and the hope of the gospel to a world that's increasingly walking away from church and from faith. Now that we're a 501c3 nonprofit, all donations are tax deductible, so we've crunched the numbers, and if each listener of this episode gave just $1 for each episode you listen to, we'd put a huge dent in our annual budget. So consider giving today. Go to theologybythepint.org/give and click the link to donate. Thanks so much, and now back to our show.
the keen Arminian theologian, and let's all remind ourselves that the Arminians come out of the Reformed tradition, right?
Yeah.
The keen Arminian theologian will try to have their cake and eat it too, and say, well, yeah, it was like that, but because of God's prevenient grace, he has put everybody back into a neutral state at which they can agree or disagree. So it's basically like everybody gets put back into the state of Adam and Eve in the garden, and then they can choose to resist.
But Reformed and Lutheran reject prevenient
that
grace as a concept.
Well, they reject a universal prevenient grace. Yeah. So not everybody gets to be put into this neutral spot. I mean, I believe in prevenient grace because that just means the grace that comes before salvation, right? Like,
Sure.
You can define that in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
I think the reformers often use today, at least, in the common Vorlage as common grace.
Yeah.
But you're right, as far as this is something that has grown out of a Reformed doctrine of man, and especially a Reformed doctrine of sin and the fall, against the Roman Catholic view of that, which is that there's just a diminishing of the will because Adam didn't receive the donum superaddendum. So really what was lost was just diminished will. Whereas the Reformers in the Westminster Confession and all the way back to Calvin would say that no, the entire nature of man was corrupted, both their will and their intellect. And so this is why we can explain passages like, renew your mind because there's something wrong with your mind, or Ephesians 2, which is also the noetic effects of sin on the mind, the futility of the mind and the sinful desires of the mind, which means for the Reformed is that epistemology is a moral question as much as it is a question of, logic and quantity or quality. Or it's every single thought has a moral agency to it. And so Van Til is trying to bring that and take that captive to our discussions in apologetics. And so I think what you said about imaginative apologetics, that's very interesting. I think that's a brilliant persuasive tactic as far as I can see. Probably you might agree with this, Austin, that you see Jesus using the same thing in his parables as far as how he's persuading others to do, how he's persuading people to take account of what it is that he's saying to them as he captures their imagination with a parable. And then he, lays down the hammer. So I think that has some persuasive power. And I think Van Til would be very interested in a lot of new developing and older versions of different persuasion. He would say use all that persuasion, but just make sure you do it with the dictionary of the Reformed system of doctrine that's given to us in Scripture.
When you say the dictionary, like put this in terms that dumb person can understand.
Yeah.
Because right now, everything y'all are saying none of it sounds like you really disagree. It just sounds like different ways of describing the same thing.
I'll get there if you want me to.
So, and we will. I'll let Evan
Sure.
lead into that. But when you say do you mean understand the terms like the same way? So, say I'm talking to an unbeliever, and they're like, "How can you be so crazy to believe da da da?" And I'm about to, throw down some truth. Do I say, let's get on the same page? Is that what you mean? What do you mean when you say that?
Yeah, I think what is meant by that is the phrase is epistemologically self-conscious, which is that the apologist, especially the Christian apologist, understands that the definitions of truth and the definitions that are appropriate to be using are things that are not just brute facts out there, but are created by God. So if there's anything that's true whatsoever, it's because it's his first and our second.
Okay.
And
So
But Austin thinks that too.
Not necessarily.
Okay, say more.
So created things are created by God, but God himself is a brute fact, right? There is nothing higher than God to which you can appeal. Now, Van Til and many of his followers, I'm thinking of Brant Bosserman in particular, I think is an egregious offender in this score, will say that the laws of logic are created by God. They're not part of God's nature. So what that, and now other people will say differently, and they'll draw in the archetypal and ectypal distinction. So what does that mean? It means
Don't even know one of those
So
words.
it means that everything that is created by God, and it bears God's fingerprint. And so the things that we do and think are shadows or echoes on a smaller dimension than what God does and thinks. Our knowledge is not the same thing as God's knowledge. And that would include the laws of logic, including things like the laws of non-contradiction. Mm-hmm. So Van Til very infamously teaches, for instance, that God is one person and three persons. Mm-hmm. Not, according to the Nicene distinction, that God is one being or one essence and three persons.
Blessed Trinity.
Yes,
Okay,
so you'll get Van Tilians, presuppositionalists, that try to tease this out and say, oh, well, that must mean that the law of non-contradiction, that a thing can't both be and not be at the same time, must be a created principle and not part of the essence of God. Now, this is an intra-Van Tilian debate, because you've got other Van Tilians like Vern Poythress or John Frame who will say this is a part of the knowledge of God. So I'm not trying to paint everybody with the same brush here. But I have a hesitation when we get back and we say everything that we do is created, or everything that we think is created, because some of it is not. When we're using the three fundamental laws of logic, for instance, all of those things are not created. They are necessarily true in every possible world. Why? Because they are a part of God's being. Mm-hmm. And when we participate in them, yes, we participate in them because we receive them from God, but not because they're created. They cannot be otherwise.
Why does that distinction matter?
Well, it matters because if God can create the laws of logic, then God can violate the laws of logic. If it can be the case that the law of non-contradiction can be violated, then it doesn't really matter if we debate whether God exists, because he can both exist and not exist at the same time. He can be both good and evil.
Okay. I think I understand.
I want to go back, though, to more like of a street level apologetic.
Well, I mean, I think debating whether we can say God could be evil if he wanted to be is pretty important, but
yeah,
let's.
I've never heard that. I've never heard of any of those people you mentioned. I don't know that they have particularly significant followings, but maybe they do. I don't know. Do they?
But I have heard plenty of people talk about God being evil.
John Frame and Vern Poythress are two of the biggest expositors of Van Til alive.
Yeah, John Frame I'm familiar with. So he would say God can be evil?
No, so I said they're the ones that would deny this.
Oh, okay.
So Van Til, again, you can probably cite the primary literature better than me on this score, Jonathan, but
maybe not.
But Van Til and many of his followers will argue that the laws of logic in our world do not operate the same as they do in God's mind. And so Van Til will say there's this antithesis between believers and unbelievers. He'll also say that our knowledge and God's knowledge do not correspond at any point. So if I think, for instance, if I have a definition, going back to definition of terms, of what goodness means, or of what justice means, or what reason means, if we follow Van Til's logic there, then that means whatever I think goodness is, that's not what it is for God.
All right, I want to come back to that, and I want to come back to the laws of logic later, because I think that's very niche, to be honest. I think the more pertinent part of this conversation is what is the nature of man, because depending on how you understand and what you understand unregenerate, specifically man, to be, then that will dictate how you present the gospel to him. And that is where the real dividing line is in day-to-day apologetics or evangelism activity.
Well, sure, but what does Van Til say? Okay, look, we've got this unregenerate man. We have a complete antithesis. We have no common ground of reasoning with the believer and the unbeliever. So where do you start? Step one, the reductio ad absurdum. Show them that all of the intellectual capital they have is either self-contradictory or it's borrowed from the Christian system. Step two, present the Christian system, start with the presupposition of the Trinity as the solution to the problem of the one and the many, and then move on from there. So that's Van Til's method. He starts with the Trinity, and he defines the Trinity as one person and three persons.
So I have read other articles. I think the idea that Van Til is not I don't know. He was an Orthodox Trinitarian. That is what I believe. I think that he had a particular way as a philosopher of speaking of personhood. But I have read of many people, including R.C. Sproul, I don't believe thought he was in any way unorthodox as a Trinitarian. I mean, do you really think he was not a Trinitarian Orthodox, not an Orthodox Trinitarian?
I would hope that he was, because he subscribed to the Westminster Confession of Faith. Yeah. So in his confession and in his preaching, I would hope that he upholds those principles. But if you want to, I can pull it up right here on the phone. We can read the passage. Yeah. And then many of his followers have taken that and run whole hog with it.
But even a word like person doesn't have this is the whole. Yeah. I mean, we're gonna end up with homo and homoousios in Greek terms and what in their exact meaning, and that's, I would argue, impossible to perfectly. I mean, even the Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity, of one being in three person, is itself a barely adequate, if at all adequate, understanding of the Trinity, because we are literally trying to understand divine mystery in human language, which we would all, I think, agree is we are trying to capture the infinite with finite words. I mean, so we're going to be limited with words. I just don't think I have never heard that the Van Tillian presuppositional method leads people into an unorthodox Trinitarianism.
So Van Til uses one person, three person when he says God is one person, and synonymous with he is absolute personality. And he gets that from Herman Bavinck, page 303 or 305 of his Dogmatics.
Okay.
Where
I'm just going to fact check that real fast. No, I'm kidding.
Summarize the problem, though. Yeah. Summarize the position. We're losing people.
Yeah, what you have is and this is Van Til's sort of, on the one side you have what's called the Boston Personalists. This is his first dissertation that Van Til his dissertation that he focuses on, where he's basically saying the Boston Personalists, which are saying, not everything is water, not everything is matter, everything is person. And what ends up is you have Christian species of these, I think it's Dorn, I can't remember, who basically argues that God is absolute person, you don't really need the distinctions in the Godhead, because it's actually trivial if he's just absolute person. So you have that on the one side. And then on the next side, you have somebody like Gordon Clark, who comes and says he calls it the principle of individuation. And he says, it's the theory of individuation, I believe. And it's, God is three thought bundles, because a person is somebody who's self-conscious. And the oneness is unconscious and mute. And so Van Til was like, well, that's actually heretical. We don't believe that the one God in his unity is unconscious and mute, because as soon as you have subsistence, the Son subsisting entirely in the Godhead and the Spirit and the Father, then you have this dialectic between conscious and unconscious, personhood and non-personhood, which he thinks violates the law of simplicity. So, and perichoresis and coherence. So Gordon Clark never worked out well, how is coherence and perichoresis actually doable in the Trinity? He just basically said his theory of individuation is a solve for the paradox of the Trinity, which is, I think, summed up when every time I think about the three, I understand the one. And every time I think about the one, I understand the three. So what Van Til was trying to say is what Bavinck has done and what Hodge has done. Hodge said God is one will, one conscience in his unity. And Bavinck also says he's one conscious, one will in his unity. And that's why you have, according to Bavinck, you have this, not this nature-grace dualism, but you have this organic expression of both supernatural and natural revelation, and everything is expressed in these personal terms. So Van Til takes that and he says, well, there is an equal ultimacy in the Trinity, and his shorthand for that is three person, one person. But what he means by that is exactly what Bavinck meant, which is absolute personalism that does not threaten the three persons of the Trinity. So that's why he said it.
Can I go back to something a little bit more fundamental? You guys talking about the Trinity, Austin, you just said that the Van Til method is first show people that their worldview is absurd in that it doesn't provide the best explanation for things, right? And then
that it's self-contradictory.
Right. And then the second step is to go to the Trinity. Is that true? Is that the Van Tilian method? Like, sort of set the stage? Because that seems like a leap.
I think, that I can imagine somebody has potentially done that method. I think the method of apologetics looks different for every single particular person that you run into. So what Van Til talked about was the principle of the idea, which is that no matter who you talk to, you could use cosmological argument, you could use reductio ad absurdum, you could invoke the truthfulness of the resurrection and all the witnesses. As you do any of that, know that it's within this system. Bahnsen was famous for doing something like what Austin did because he was talking to a lot of, rabid atheist philosophers. And so he was going straight into a philosophical discussion about
Interesting.
the impossibility of the contrary and such. So that's one expression of it.
I would say this because I think we're kind of in the weeds. Like, I think the first goal of presuppositionalism is to take the unbiblical point of view as far as it can go until you prove its utter futility. So I mean that would be one strategy. But basically, you want to point out to the unbeliever that they can't make moral claims. Absolutely. So you point out that they're moral relativists. You point out that they can't make sense of the world the way that it is. That they're living on borrowed capital. But really, that they're. But that is a method that you would embrace if you believe that there is not a neutral place to which both people can go to sort of have a friendly conversation about the nature of things. Van Til views the confrontation between a believer and an unbeliever as exactly that, as a confrontation. It might be friendly and civil, but it still is a confrontation. The evidential school seems to have this is why I keep asking about the nature of man and the nature of unregenerate man. They seem to believe that, yes, man may be unregenerate, but it is still possible that you can both go to a little island, we'll call it neutral island, and there you can have a philosophical conversation about reason and rationality and philosophy and evidences. And that unbeliever will give a fair listen to all of that. He will rationally assess it and come to a rational conclusion. And Van Til is saying, no, the unbeliever is going to judge all of that on the basis of his worldview. So you have to attack the worldview. And you can, I think, do that largely through a Socratic method or, through a friendly conversation by really just asking a handful of the right questions, and you kind of get them to understand that they can't account for the world that they say is good. They can't account for good. They can't account for, the old joke is they can't account for counting. But anyway, so I've never heard people go into most Christians don't even know what the doctrine of the Trinity is. I can't imagine being an apologist and being like, the first thing I'm going to lay on an unbeliever is this doctrine of the one and the many, or how the Trinity solves the one and the many. So I haven't heard that. Where I would go, because I do this to college students regularly, is usually it's the moral argument with a presuppositional frame. So
say what that might look like.
Well. So is murder wrong? Yes. So why? And so then there's an accounting for why murder is wrong, and I can't play act it in my own head, but it's not hard to get them to understand that they will actually make exceptions for murder in any number of cases, without being able to make sense of why. They don't have
or that, my society might say this is wrong, but other people might say differently, and morality really changes based on what our social consensus is.
Yeah.
Okay, well, therefore you can make no moral judgments.
Right.
Yeah.
But notice what we're doing here. We're appealing to syllogistic logical reasoning with the unbeliever to show them why their worldview is bankrupt.
Which is your camp, is what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, that's because syllogistic logical reasoning is something that has been given to us by God, and if we use it faithfully,
is it his nature?
Well, both. He gives us himself.
I know. I'm just being a pill.
Yeah.
Continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah. To your point, this is Van Til's issue with the classical, I would say, Roman Catholic tradition, is that when you have the donum superaddendum, what happens?
The what?
The donum superaddendum.
He just did a spell on all of us.
So for the superadded grace.
Yeah. So there's a sharp distinction in Catholic theology, or in certain strands of pre-20th century Catholic theology, between nature and supernature. So in
supernature.
Yeah. So in Adam, what he has is a completely intact natural being. And then he gets an extra gift on top of that of supernatural grace. And when he falls, only the gift gets taken away, but his regular nature is still intact and functional. Yeah. And so you've got Cajetan and these other Thomistic interpreters afterwards, which will say there are two ends of man. There is a natural end of man and a supernatural end of man. That nowadays has been walked back pretty significantly in Roman Catholic theology after the 20th century. And I think rightly so, because I don't think that's what Thomas says.
Wait, say that one more time. That sounded important.
So there's a movement in 20th century Catholic theology called the Nouvelle Théologie.
Okay.
Henri de Lubac, Ratzinger actually was affiliated with it, the good Pope. And all of this leads into Vatican II, and to the revisions that happen in Catholic dogma in Vatican II. Yeah, there were revisions in dogma. So the issue with a lot of people's gripes with Thomism is not necessarily with Thomas himself. It's with Cajetan and these other people that interpret him afterwards.
Yeah, Bellarmine.
Bellarmine, like all these folks. But the 20th century guys said, well, let's go back and read Thomas again, and let's see
Thomas Aquinas, as you're talking about,
if he's actually saying these things. Anyway, all of that to say, that's what the donum superaddendum is.
Okay. You're right. I think Gilson makes a good case to reread Thomas in a different light. And I'm like, cool, let's read him in a different light. That's fine. But he does say, I can't remember, I can't cite it, but it's question 52 or something like that, where it's about the logical end of the donum superaddendum, which why is it fitting that God should set it up this way, where you have man just that has nothing but access to nature, but then God has to come and give him this special access to grace, the donum superaddendum. And Thomas Aquinas says what happens is man and his intellect is reproportioned no longer to a mediated view of the essence, but participates in the essence of God in his intellect, which is pretty strange for Thomas to say, because Thomas already said in his doctrine of God that you cannot add or take away to the essence of God, or else it's not God, because it basically blows simplicity up. So Van Til sees that and is like, this isn't a really good structure. This isn't reformed on the doctrine of man. This isn't reformed on the eschatology of our intellect. This isn't reformed at any point. We need to, make sure that what we're using in things like evidences and demonstrations, syllogisms, logic, are used and a worldview that is actually true according to the scriptures and not according to what Thomas said.
Let me ask you this. Can a Christian apologist use good evidence for God in an unrighteous or unbiblical manner?
Wait, say it again.
Okay, can a talk right
Sure,
now?
I think so.
Can a Christian, can someone make arguments for God in the wrong way?
Yeah.
In a way that dishonors God, in a way that this would be sidetrack. This would be another one of my critiques of a lot of evidential apologists. It elevates the listener to a place they don't belong. They're an unbeliever. Yeah, they're a human being made in God's image, worthy of respect and honor. But we're placing before them this choice. Like, hey, we're gonna put you in the position to judge God. This is the C.S. Lewis God in the dock concept. Wait a minute. We're not putting God in the dock, the witness stand. He's the judge. It's us who is in the dock. And so presuppositionalism, I think, is faithful in the sense that it doesn't put God on trial. It reminds you that you are on trial, and you have to account for the way that things are, and you fail at it apart from God. In fact, whenever I'm doing evangelism, which is, by the way, the context for which apologetics is necessary, it is my stated goal on the innermost part of my being to drive them to absurdity. That is my goal. That is my hope and desire. That I will point out the absolute absurdity to the person. I'm not trying to be nice. I'm not trying to be winsome. I'm not trying to be like, oh, please,
That's
just
Evan's tagline.
If you'll only believe in God.
I think he's got T-shirts with that on there.
Yeah.
Drive them to a place of
So
Can you show me a biblical model where somebody does evangelism that way?
Repent and believe. It's what John the Baptist does. It's what Jesus says.
I'm talking about driving their position to the point of absurdity. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying your presupposed starting point is we're going to do this the way that Scripture tells us to.
Yeah.
Well, Romans 1 leads into that in Romans 2.
That's not evangelism, though.
Acts 17.
Well, it's to
The God, you have a temple to an unknown God. And I think his point is that's absurd.
Well, that's not what he says, though. He says, the God that you worship without knowing it, I'm going to reveal to you. And then he quotes two pagan poets writing hymns to Zeus to say, this is who God is. And look around at all of creation, and look, you already know that God has given you common grace and is drawing you to himself. And that's how Paul presents the gospel, is by not with the antithesis, but by establishing common ground between himself and the Athenians.
That's a good point.
Oh, there's common ground.
Yeah.
Well, that's not what Van Til says.
No.
Yeah, the image bearing.
There is an antithesis, and let me say more accurately. This is where Van Til is inconsistent with himself. And if you read Keith Matheson's most recent book on this, I think he does a really good job at pressing this point.
Disagree.
Van Til says.
Oh, here we go.
Van Til says there is an absolute antithesis in the knowledge of the believer and the unbeliever. He also admits that there is common grace and that unbelievers are inconsistent and many times reason like Christians. If believers are inconsistent and many times reason like Christians, and there is a common grace that allows you to have some sort of shared standing ground with them, to be fair, because they're standing on your ground, not because you're standing on theirs, then what is the point of the transcendental argument? What is the point of this particular method as the only consistent Christian apologetic method over against any other method that might be useful?
I lost you there for a little bit. I would say that, yes, there is an ultimate antithesis. And just as Paul says in Colossians 2, we have all the wisdom in Christ. That's kata. That's not according to human tradition or or the elementary principles of the world, but according to Christ. At the same time, the point of contact is the fact that all men are created as image bearers. And so the point of contact is that image bearing status that they have. The point of contact is actually he's on your ground, not that he's on another ground and you're on another ground. Epistemologically, that's the case. But there's a difference. I don't think Keith understands the difference between, a psychological distinction of knowledge and epistemological distinction of knowledge.
I think that's funny because that's exactly what I'd say about Van Til, is that he confuses the ordo cognoscendi with the ordo essendi. Which is to say the order of knowing is not the same thing as the order of being. We can that might be in the weeds again. But
Well,
we've
that
been
might
in the
be,
weeds for a while,
but
friends.
to go
Yeah.
back to what you were saying, Evan, I think that there is a demonstration of what you were talking about biblically, which is Paul gives a diagnosis in Romans 1, which holds men without an apologetics, without excuse, but then he carries it into Romans 2. It's the exact same phrase, which is, therefore, O man, you have no excuse. And he just lists all those sins, that maliciousness that you just, heard in Romans 1. They are malicious, envy, disobedient to parents, right? And then in Romans 2, he goes for, I think, an internal critique, which drives somebody to absurdity, which is you judge people who do this, but you do them yourself. And so that, I think, is an internal inconsistency that Paul demonstrates for the Romans that show, in one sense, it's not the only sense, that every man acts in this particular way, and they can't get away from it. They act as if they are image bearers. They might suppress the truth and unrighteousness, but there is no point at which they can consistently stop being an image bearer. And so, how do I know this? Look, you are upset at other people when they do this to you, when they gossip about you, when they slander you.
Cut in line, yeah.
But yet you do the very things that you're upset about.
Yeah.
And so,
And by the way, it's not that I'm trying to make someone look absurd, feel badly about themselves. I'm talking in sheer technical terms. Like absurdity is where I want them to I want them to go sit in the reality that they've just had a conversation where they, for the first time probably in their life, have been challenged in a way that basically forced them to confront the reality that they can't account for their own point of view about almost anything. They hold contradictory view after contradictory view on, the value of human life, and then, the defense of abortion, I don't know. Other examples come up in conversation, but that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get them to understand the absurdity of their position, and then offer them a whole point of view, like a whole system that makes sense of things, that makes sense of sin and grace and forgiveness and compassion and mercy and justice and all of those concepts, which only Christianity, I think we would all agree, does.
Yeah, you're right. So, I mean, the doctrine of the fall really is kind of the big key that unlocks a lot of the human experience, right? Well, there's this mixture of good and evil that we see in the world, and as Solzhenitsyn said, right, the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. Why do we have this weird, chaotic experience of moral confusion? Well, because of the fall. That's the reason. Like, Christianity can account for that. It can give you moral objectivism and the weird psychology. But I want to get back to this, the point about psychology, because I think it's really important. Yeah. Van Til did not invent presuppositionalism. Just like with imaginative apologetics, the concept has been around for a lot longer than the word has. And so when I say that I consider myself a presuppositionalist, this is what I mean, is I think there is a particular way that human beings operate psychologically. And I think it goes back to Augustine and the way that Augustine is doing things. There's a big debate that starts in late antiquity and moves through the Middle Ages about voluntarism, right? Is reason in charge of the will and the desire and the affections, or do the affections lead reason? And different people take different positions. I think we all see, as you're very right to point out nowadays, Evan, most people, their affections, really, by and large, it's not their affections, it's their passions, right? Are leading them to ex post facto, after the fact, justify rationally the things that they are doing. Yeah. So they're not in this neutral position of, I'm going to compute and Mr. Spock logically deduce what my behavior ought to be. I have things that I really feel, that I really want. I'm going to do what I love. And then
say I deserve it,
and then justify it to myself using reason. And I do think that is how fallen human beings operate. In which case, you have to, as Augustine says, retrain the affections. You have to reteach people what to love, because the root of sin is disordered love. And so if you begin your apologetics at the level of teaching people what to love again, then their reason will listen. But you cannot start. Yeah, you can have the most knockdown, drag out, bang up, airtight argument for the resurrection of Christ. I mean, I think William Lane Craig and Gary Habermas have pretty much done that, right? There's a reason William Lane Craig doesn't lose debates. I mean, it's because he prepares the heck, but it's also because you can't fight the truth.
Yeah.
Right? This happened. But people don't care because their love is somewhere where it shouldn't be.
Can you give an example of, I mean, you can make it up, but just you're talking to someone who's not a believer. Give a couple of sentences that you might say to help them assess their misplaced love.
So I think a lot of people hate God because they assume God is like us. And their experience, for instance, of somebody with an infinite amount of power does not correspond to their conception of somebody with an infinite amount of goodness. I think
Is
nowadays,
this the whole why doesn't he step in and
well, I
heal
mean,
my
you can
cancer?
have power, you can have goodness, but it seems like nowadays you can't really have both, and that's every aspect of the media pumps that into us. If God is supposed to be our judge, well, gosh, don't we see every day that these judges are using their intersectional racial biases and prejudices to create injustice? Well, if God is just the biggest and worst form of that, then I don't want anything to do with him. Leave me alone. Okay, but what if I showed you somebody like Aragorn?
Oh, here we go.
I mean,
This is from Tolkien.
You told me
You have to,
told
I
me
know.
the imaginative,
Okay,
right?
you have to tell me the actor. Is that Vigo?
Legolas.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why didn't you go with Legolas?
Austin's dying inside a little bit.
Legolas has about 5 lines in the whole what if I showed you a way in which somebody that was really powerful was somebody that you would actually want to submit to? Like, I think this is pretty hard in America. We don't want to submit to anybody. That's the whole point of the country.
Yeah.
Who would I really want to become completely vulnerable and submissive to? That's really scary to a lot of people because they've been hurt by a lot of people. And they have no concept, they have no rack on which to hang that form of meaning. That's what Holly Ordway and other people that teach with us will talk about, is that the point of imaginative apologetics is actually to clothe these concepts like justice and reason with the meaning that the Bible actually teaches us they have. And then you can talk about why the atonement is just and makes a lot of sense. Or then you can talk about why original sin isn't actually like a really gross and disgusting concept, right? You create the meaning because people are so far post-Christianity, they don't know what these terms mean anymore. You have to give them some sort of picture, and then you can lead them logically through that. First, you order the loves, and then you bring the reason along. So in that sense, I think that is presuppositionalism, right? They have this whole bundle of presuppositions, and in that they have a worldview. They have even if it's not completely conscious and explicit in their minds, they have all sorts of inconsistencies that their worldview is riddled with. But they have a way that they have a filter through which they're living their lives and receiving information. We've got to challenge the filter before we can let any of the information come in. So you do attack the worldview, or rather, you introduce a better one.
So what is this? Maybe make this a quick answer, but what is the method by which do we train authors to write stories, filmmakers? You
can do that. C.S. Lewis says, for instance, we don't need a bunch of Christian apologists running around. We need a bunch of Christians in various industries and fields just doing really good work and showing that this actually is the best way to live your life. So that's one answer. HC, we've got a narrative we got a narrative arts conference of Christian filmmakers and musicians that's going on tomorrow.
So C.S. Lewis said you should stop your job.
But not that everyone should do his job.
So that's one method. Another method is just like sitting and asking questions of people, like, well, why would you be so scared of giving your life to Christ? Like, if I did prove to you beyond the shadow of a doubt that the resurrection happened, would you be a Christian? Why not? Like, challenge those things. I think even in the traditional or classical apologetic approach, the use of metaphor, symbol, and analogy is the most helpful rhetorical tool in your arsenal to get people to come along with you. So you don't actually have to change your method that much. You can use this in any method. You just supplement it with a particular faculty of imagination that I think is really powerful.
Let me ask this: is I said earlier, I think Van Til was kind of prescient and almost prophetic in the sense that he foresaw the diverging worldview paths, and therefore he said our apologetics must be, worldview based, not evidence based, whatever. Like, from my point of view, as I look at news headlines, like, the world is so absurd now that like it seems to me that it seems even more obvious to me than yesterday that the only conversations they must be, and I'm not saying this isn't done through your method or whatever, but it just seems to me like we have to, like, if we have a whole section of this country that believes a boy can become a girl,
Right.
that is so crazy and so absurd that the idea of assuming kind of that I can rationalize, I can bring the Christian faith, which requires total submission to the lordship of Christ, full repentance. Like, that is such a wide gap. You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying, you and I agree on that problem, obviously. But, like, to me, it's almost like the world is getting so much crazier than even it was in the 50s when presuppositionalism was sort of popularized or whatever, that, like, I just don't see many options left. Like, we're kind of like got one more arrow in the quiver here, and it's like full-scale worldview, like, contrast,
So then what's your, like, I'll ask you the same question that I asked Austin. Like, give me some examples of how you might talk to somebody that was wildly in the wrong camp, a non-believer who's like, you're crazy to believe in God.
The best I could say because I have a hard time recreating, I should record some of these conversations I have, but I basically try to ask questions. Yeah. And I basically try to get people to account for their point of view. Most people fall into a majoritarian camp of ethics. So basically it's right if most of us want to do it.
Help society flourish if we stop killing each other, kind of thing. Okay.
So you can obviously see where, you could point to examples where there were hugely immoral things done that were legal, or a majority of people were fine with,
Like slavery.
I can give an example. I think a lot of the Van Til followers that get into the systematic delineations of knowledge and the principium condescendi and essendi and what have you, as they're talking to their interlocutors that are in a classical camp or something like that, is usually gets the lion's share of the airtime. But I think one of the most slept on apologists of our age is actually a man by the name of David Powlison. He was the president.
I've slept on him.
He was the president of CCF.
We'll talk about that later. That's a problem.
He was a CCF
what's that?
President, which is Christian Counseling and Education Foundation. So David Powlison is also a student of Van Til and was in classes with Poitras and Frame and everyone. But he was interested in psychology and biblical counseling. But he gives this example of what you're talking about, which is he was at Harvard, and in his class at Harvard, he was in Anthropology 101. And the professor comes in, there's 200 students in the class or something like that, and says, Anthropology 101, life is nasty, brutish, and short. And all we are basically wet automatons and wet robots, and here is the fossil record to prove it. So it's sort of a neo-Darwinian presentation of anthropology. And he's going through his notes, of the different pieces of evidence that he has to support his neo-Darwinian position at Harvard. And an administrator interrupts the class in the middle of that and runs in and says, Professor, I'm so sorry. There's an emergency. And he said, well, I'm in the middle of class. So what's the emergency? So the administrator blurts out what's happening instead of privately telling the professor. And the administrator says, it is your son. He was just beat up by all of his classmates.
Oh my gosh.
And that's exactly what the entire staff or the entire student body did, is they all responded in an empathetic gasp of like,
well, that was silly. Don't they just know we're just Darwinian creatures?
Well, so what Powlison recognizes is like, that's so strange that everything that he just demonstrated was brought to futility, and there wasn't even a back and forth. It was just the revelation of God just pouring in.
I assume the administrator was like a joke, right? It was like a scam. This is like a real thing.
No, so he said class dismissed, and he left.
I thought the administrator was in on the thing.
Yeah. Okay. So what's going on there, as Dr. Pallison said, was you have the revelation of God that is being poured in at every moment and at every turn to all of his image bearers all the time. This professor was really good at suppressing the truth and unrighteousness in his classroom notes. But when it came to being a father and caring about the justice of his father, more of these ethical concerns that you bring up, Evan, he's doing a pretty leaky, bad job of it. So people talk about the act of suppression that Paul uses as holding down something. Dr. Oliphant used to talk about holding down a beach ball. And sometimes it's hard to pop, it pops up and you just, put it back down. Pallison used the expression of suppression in a different way, which was it's like standing under the Niagara Falls, but you have an umbrella and you're telling everybody that you're not wet. But even though you have this great umbrella, it's like the revelation of God is pouring on every corner. So what it looks like is being wise about if I want to go into a knockout, drag-out fight with the fossil record on Darwin, and if I'm skilled enough to do that, then that's what I'll do. I'll raise my hand and say, actually, the fossil record proves something totally different, and Darwin was, basically futile in his philosophical construction. He's a Galilean, and that's correlative. There's no way to make sense of that. If you're skilled enough to do that, great. But you know enough as a Christian to go in and say to that professor, how is your son doing? And immediately it's, I think something similar that you said, Austin, the walls are down and he's on your camp and he's actually swimming in your world. It's harder for him to suppress the truth in that world. So you begin to introduce themes of what does it look like for your son to be righted? What does justice look like? And is it even possible for you to instruct your son on how to forgive others? And that type of into the fact that he's an image bearer, and the Lord is revealing that to him all the time from every single corner, not just through, the laws of logic or some sort of cosmological argument or some sort of design in the cell. All of those reveal the Lord as well. But at every moment, the Lord is pouring in his revelation. And so you, as an apologist, you be wise into what does this person care about? What is his...
I have to jump in here though and say maybe our listeners are thinking this, or maybe I'm just dumb and everybody else gets it. But Austin talking about someone that, thinks that if God exists, he'd be like all the bad judges we see, and then saying, but what would a good judge look like, or what would a good king look like, and kind of painting this picture of someone would be worthy of submitting to, like Aragorn or somebody else. And then you talking about taking the story of this man and using that as kind of your jumping off place to say, like, what does justice look like? Is there a world where forgiveness wins? Those two things sound very much the same to me. Both of them are appealing to what people already think about the world that they live in, where things are wrong. What does it look like for things to actually be put right? So I guess I just don't quite understand where the difference lies, except when you guys start talking about these kind of really niche philosophical things. But both of your conversations sound really similar.
Yeah, that's probably fair. No, I think the same thing, Sarah. We're ultimately telling stories. We're helping people to see the narrative in a particular way. We talk about the transgender thing, Evan. What has been one of the most effective ways of actually getting people to change their mind on this issue? It's not showing them the statistics.
Hearing the stories of
the D-trans. It's hearing the D-trans story. That's why they get blocked, right? That's why Chloe Cole gets blacklisted. It's showing them pictures of, okay, well, this is what the operation actually looks like. Mm-hmm. And like the 11 or 12-year-old girl that has no skin on her forearm, mm-hmm. right? This is what this looks like, right? This is the meaning of the terms that you're using. When you say gender-affirming care, you mean this.
Right.
So I think that is an effective approach. And I think it's an effective approach because, as we have said, there is no neutral ground. We're all on God's turf. We have all been designed by God, and God has given us something called a natural law, right? Because we are image bearers, we don't have to see ourselves as in confrontation necessarily. We know, as Augustine and the other fathers said, that all truth is God's truth. And whatever has been rightly said by any man belongs to us Christians. I think that's Clement of Alexandria. So we don't need to come at them with something external to themselves, because we know that inside it's already there. There are areas of their life where they're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, but there's always some area of their life when they're not. Right? There's somewhere that they are living according to the natural law. And I think we press in on that. Now, this is where I have...
That's kind of what you were saying.
So this is why I say, look, I'm on board with presuppositionalism. I'm not on board with Van Tillian presuppositionalism, because my understanding of that is Van Til, maybe he's just being hyperbolic, or maybe he really believes it, but he will say things like, all these other classical apologists prior to this have started off with corrupted frameworks, right? They allowed non-Christian philosophy to infiltrate and infect their apologetics. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to tell you how to start with a real Christian
Purist,
apologetic methodology.
Yeah.
And I just think that seems really arrogant to me.
Yeah.
Now, again, there's all sorts of... So Van Til's an apologist, and then there's all sorts of apologists for Van Til, and they're going to come in and say that's not really what he meant.
Yeah. Okay. We have to wrap it up. I know you need to go somewhere. There's a bell ringing downstairs, a door I have to go answer. That's an appointment I'm now a little late for because of tech issues. I blame Apple Computer, so apologies for that. Austin, where can people find you?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Dr. Austin Freeman. I'm also at the hc.edu website. You can take some courses with us, or you can catch me on March 22nd at Apologetics Day.
And Sarah, where can people find you?
At all of our events. Now, how would you know where those events are? And I have a great answer for you. It's theologybythepint.org, theologybythepint.org. You can find out everything you need to know about our events, who we are, all that jazz.
And Jonathan?
I don't have a personal website or anything like that. I'm very skittish on social media too. But I would say just go to Westminster's website, wts.edu. I did talk to Juan Carlos this last week. We are going to have a seminary on Saturday event in the Woodlands on August 5th.
A seminary on Saturday? What does that mean?
Seminary on Saturday. It's 2 professors come and they give basically seminary level education to the church.
Nice.
Just on a Saturday.
How much is that?
It'll be in the $20 to $40 range.
Nice. Okay.
It's sorry, not August. It's April 5th, and it will be up in the Woodlands. Dr. Stafford Carson and Dr. Dave Garner will come and talk about the mission of the church.
Cool.
And I'm Evan McClanahan, the pastor at First Lutheran. Sorry to bring things to an end quickly. Your last statements were so good, I'm going to count them as your closing statements. So apologies for that. For more reading, I think people maybe look up, I don't know.
Tolkien and Van Til?
Tolkien and Van Til. I don't know. Okay. Start there. But anyway, find these guys, ask them questions. Sorry there's no video today. Podcast listeners don't care. But until next time, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.